To be back amongst you. So I have history with some of the folks here. And maybe most of you knew that Ann DeGroot was my boss for many years and colleague. We were really, you made it possible for us to be equals by the kind of leadership you did when we worked first at the Gay and Lesbian Community Action Council, which then we saw through its transformation to what remains to be Outfront Minnesota, which does tremendous advocacy work on behalf of the LGBT communities around the state. And then in that work, I was the deputy director in charge of programs, and so I was supervising the work we did in domestic violence intervention, focused on same-sex domestic violence. However, some of our funding came through the Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women. And in those days, Liz Richards was a key mover and shaker and organizer in that movement. And I have to say, you made me feel welcome, Liz, because I was one of the few male-identified people who went to those meetings, and women who were like working on the issues about what causes violence within a relationship and all that kind of stuff. There were reasons to mistrust a male-identified person. So you were part of what made it possible for me to be there, and I was in those rooms and at those tables, and partly by your example, nobody looked at me and said, "What are you doing here?" So anyway, and I came to know Liz Pierce too through other reasons related to your work as an attorney. Anyway, so, and then my dear friend Mary is somebody I've known for several years now. So, like I say, it's really nice to be here again. I will just say again, I mentioned this last time, but I definitely bring greetings from my home congregation, which is Living Table United Church of Christ, and we are housed in a three-church initiative in South Minneapolis called New Branches. So we've been there for a few years now. All right, please pray with me. Holy One, Spirit of life and love, may we be open to feeling your presence in us and around us this day. May we feel the Christ presence which you have sent to us so that connection with you is accessible to all. Be with us in this time together, and my words, may they do no damage. Amen. So lucky for me that as the Christian theologian Paul Tillich is credited with saying, doubt is not the opposite of faith. Doubt is an element of faith. So when I get a chance to preach and you don't have a topic that you want me to address, I turn to the Revised Common Lectionary, which a lot of churches, including the Catholic churches, use that lectionary usually. And I look at what the readings are for the day, and here we go. The gospel reading for today, as assigned, was from the Gospel of John. I have a long history personally of struggle with the Gospel of John, and I'll get into that more in a minute. But I just think, thank God somebody as prestigious as Paul Tillich said, doubt is an element of faith. So I invite us to just, wherever that lands for you, is just be open to that this is not a done deal. The universe is constantly evolving. We are not done. We are not finished products of evolution. We are part of ongoing evolution. And I think I mentioned that a little bit last time when I talked about thresholds and being in liminal space. Anyway, it helps me to keep that in mind and approach our faith with an open heart and with a lot of questions. When I do sometimes personify God, I can picture somebody, them, sitting there, wherever that would be, and saying, oh good, doubt, now we've got something to work with. So hopefully this will fit for you as well. So these I am statements in the Gospel of John, whoa, what a territory we jump into. There are 7 of them, and they are perplexing for many of us. They seem to have an exclusionary nature that troubles me, because what I call Jesus' one and only, or the only me syndrome, that seems to come up a lot in this gospel. Things where Jesus says, no one gets to the Father unless it is through me. That's from John 14. Or, I am the way, the truth, the life. When taken at face value, statements like these seem to be a theological litmus test. Do you believe or not believe? Do you belong or do you not belong? And they can be have a very exclusionary effect on people who may not have really delved into what's behind those statements. Why would this Jesus character, as represented in John, say these things when it seems like it puts a lot of people outside the community? So that's one of the problems that I have with the Gospel of John. Not that I don't love the Gospel of John, because I love how right at the beginning we're swept up and away, if you will, into that swirl of what I would call the cosmic mysticism of that prologue. Remember the prologue. In the beginning was the divine word and wisdom. Wisdom is also Sophia, a feminine aspect of God. The divine word and wisdom was there with God, and it was what God was. It was there in the beginning with God. Everything came to be by means of it. Nothing that exists came to be without its agency. It was life. In it was life. And this life was the light of humanity. Light was shining in the darkness, and darkness did not master or overcome it. So what a glorious hymn John opens with. But what an enigmatic one it is. What on earth is John talking about? It's very perplexing, and I'll say a little more about that in a moment when I get to what I think mysticism means. So let me say a bit about the translation that I used for today. And my apologies that we didn't try to inclusify it at all. I used the gospel translation that was done by the scholars of the Jesus Seminar back in 1993. Some of you may be familiar with their work, but they set out to try to decide. This is a group of maybe 80 or 90 scholars, men and women, although the women were only about 3 women as I looked at who was part of the seminar. But they set out trying to figure out, is there any way to tell what Jesus actually said? Because there's so much in the New Testament, in the Gospels especially, that we say Jesus said this. Well, they didn't have their cell phones then, and they didn't have the recording devices going to record what he was saying. And when you get to the Gospel of John, it was written probably a good 60 years after Jesus' death. So this was a whole different group of people by that time. And by that time, Christianity had come to evolve as a thing rather than as a sect of Judaism. So it was already starting to be set apart in many ways. So here we get to the Gospel of John, the latest of the Gospels, and John, whoever the Johannine writer was, starts writing all these things down. So the Jesus Seminar said, what did Jesus actually say? And what they did was, I guess we have to do a whole new translation of the Gospels, because they weren't satisfied with how things might have gotten changed and interpreted over history with the scholarship that went on to give us in my congregation we use the Revised Standard Version, or the New Revised Standard Version, the NRSV, and it's a beautiful translation. There was a lot of scholarship that went into producing that, but the Jesus Seminar folks just thought, well, let's take another look. So what we get with them are direct translations from the classical Greek, or the ancient Greek, and the Aramaic, and they try to put it in terms of what it would have sounded like then. And in Greek, some of you may know Greek, and I don't, but I understand that there are many layers, and that the verb tenses change depending on the context, and that isn't always reflected. So what the Jesus Seminar translation does is you'll read a passage that you think is very familiar, and then suddenly it's in present tense. Like, here's what's happening right now. Now we say, or now Jesus says, rather than said. And I'm fascinated by that. So anyway, they also include the Coptic Gospel of Thomas in their translation. So they call the published version is called the Five Gospels. So it includes the Gospel of Thomas, which is predominantly a sayings gospel. So it's not a synoptic. It doesn't start at the beginning and say, here's the birth history of Jesus. It jumps right into all these things that he supposedly said. So anyway, that gives you an idea of what rabbit holes I go down. So probably some of us grew up with the version of the New Testament where the words of Jesus are in bright red. And so that really stands out. Well, the Jesus Seminar folks did a similar thing when all the scholars agreed that is a unique saying that probably has no history in other parts of oral tradition back then. This is probably something Jesus, the historic person of Jesus, probably really said this. Those are in red. Then there's some phrases that sound like Jesus and fit, but those are in pink because the scholars weren't completely sure. Then there's the gray, which is, it's kind of the right feeling, but there sayings like that occur in other places that aren't in the Christian or Jewish tradition. So anyway, then they come to the bold black. And that stuff that is assigned to Jesus by the different gospel writers, he probably never said that. Well, guess what? If you're an accountant, being in the black is a good thing. Today, for the Gospel of John, we are in the black. So all of these I am statements were probably not said by the historic Jesus. So either that disturbs you or it delights you. Or maybe both. For me, it was kind of some of both. So how do we reconcile what so many of us have been taught was the gospel truth? What about those of us who love and revere these words, these statements attributed to Jesus by John, like, I am the bread of life, but also I am the light of the world. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Because if you are one kind of Christian, these texts delight you, and you just think, oh yes, Jesus is the one. He says that right there. It's right in the print, in the bold red. But if you are another kind of Christian, then this passage or these passages disturb you. You hear it with a feeling of mild to moderate to severe discomfort, or at the very least, you're puzzled by it. And woe to you if you're not really a Christian at all. For you, this good news is very bad news, because it means you are out of the circle. You are not included. If you don't believe that way, you are in the out crowd, not the in crowd. So if you feel that way, you maybe just ignore all this in the first place. And to me, that makes me a little sad, because there's richness to be gained by doubt and by grappling with the material. So let's wrestle a little bit. So we start with that grand universality of the prologue, which I read earlier. And it seems like that is just, it includes everybody. There's just this swirl of creation in the cosmos that coalesces, that becomes what we know today and where we live today. I just think that's beautiful. But then we get to the I am statements, and suddenly it can feel like the doors are slammed shut. The evangelist who wrote John sets up the apparent exclusivity by what I have called that one and onlyness of Jesus and the nature of the I am statements. And like I said, this is where doubt enters in for me, and I hope whatever kind of God is anywhere, just like, oh good, let's wrestle with that. So one of my companions in my room of doubt was the late Marcus Borg, who was part of the Jesus Seminar, actually. He was also a professor of religion and culture at Oregon State University. He's written books like The Heart of Christianity and a bestseller called Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time. So let me quote a couple sections from that book, the latter book, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time. And in it, Borg is writing about his own days in seminary when he first encountered the disturbing conclusion that nearly all biblical scholars thought that the Gospel of John is non-historical. It's not a historical account, as the others purport to be. Borg says this: I learned that the portrait of Jesus in John's Gospel was essentially one of the Christ of faith, not the Jesus of history. Jesus never spoke of himself as the Son of God, as one with God, as the light of the world, the way, the truth, the life, and so forth. Borg's image of Jesus as divine Savior was basically drawn from the later portions of the gospel tradition, largely from John's Gospel, supplemented by the birth stories in Matthew and Luke. And you probably know that in Mark, the oldest of the Gospels, there is no birth narrative. We jump right in at the baptism story. And in John, there's no birth narrative either. So Borg says, I saw John as containing a distorted image of Jesus, an image I had spent years trying to believe in. I would have been happy to have John excised from the New Testament. So as Borg continues his struggles and his scholarly inquiry, he had in his mid-30s what he himself calls a number of experiences of nature mysticism. They were marked by radical amazement, moments of transformed perception where he saw the earth as, and this is a quote, filled with the glory of God and shining with radiant presence. Those specific descriptive phrases, Borg found those actually in the writings of a Jewish theologian, Abraham Heschel. So over time, integrating those mystical experiences, Borg began to recognize that there are at least two important ways of looking at Jesus, what Borg calls the pre-Easter Jesus, who is the Jesus as a figure of history before his death, and the post-Easter Jesus, sometimes also called the Christ of faith, which is the Jesus of Christian tradition and experience. So Borg's own relationship to John's Gospel changed as his experience grew to where later on he wrote this: the anger I felt toward John when I first learned that it was not an accurate portrayal of the historical Jesus has been replaced by a deep appreciation. To use the great I am statements that run throughout John to illustrate this point, why would the early Christian community out of which John's Gospel comes portray Jesus as saying about himself, I am the light of the world, I am the bread of the life, I am the way, the truth, and the life, if Jesus did not say that about himself? So why would they say that? And Borg says, I now see the answer. This is how they experienced the post-Easter Jesus. That's what they felt. That's what they experienced. Borg says, for them, the post-Easter Jesus was the light that led them out of the darkness. It was the spiritual food that nourished them in the midst of their journey. It was the way that led them from death to life. That is, John's Gospel is a powerful testimony to the reality and significance of the post-Easter Jesus, the living Christ of Christian experience. John's Gospel is true, even though its account of Jesus' life story and sayings is not, by and large, historically factual. Whew, that's a lot to take in. But I would say thank you, Dr. Borg. You saved me a lot of need to explain what it is that I too believe and how I approach biblical material in general, but particularly John's Gospel. So I don't know what the title was. I didn't look at that for the sermon. I originally called it John's Mystical Jesus, and then I added a first phrase called One Little Word, John's Mystical Jesus. So I'm helped in this whole thing by something my own pastor said just a couple weeks ago. I was telling her I was going to preach on this, and here we go with John and all my doubts and everything, and she said, oh, it helps me, she said, when I pay attention to what some scholars call the predicate nominative. And I'm thinking, I'm an English major, and I'm trying to remember what the predicate nominative is. It's the word is. I-S, one little word, is. This is, blah, blah, blah. Some scholars believe that that is, that predicate nominative, is implied in these statements that appear in John. So listen to this. What if I am the bread of life is I am is the bread of life. I am is the light of the world. What this takes us back to is Moses. Remember that bit about the burning bush? And then this voice of God, and God sends Moses. As Moses is hearing this, Moses is supposed to go down and lead the people out of Egypt. And if you can imagine being Moses, I'd just say, just a second. I'm not the one. And God reassures Moses that, yes, you are. I choose you. You're it. And then Moses says, well, how am I going to go back to the people and tell them that I've been sent to lead you out? I'm Moses. I've just taken care of my sheep up here on this mountain. They aren't going to believe me. Tell me your name. I have to tell them who is sending me. And again, I picture this God almost as an entity in a human form, just like scratching its head, their head, and saying, nobody's ever asked me my name before like that. So I just imagine this long pause, maybe several eons in terms of creation, where God is thinking and then just says, well, I am. I am what I am. I'm thinking, well, that's not a big help. And when you go to the Hebrew, which also has many different layers to it, another translation is, I am what I am. And then another translation, which I love, is, I am that which I am becoming, which brings it into the present tense, the present moment. Oh, God is telling Moses, I just am, and I always am, and I always am amming. I am always is, and I am always becoming. So when we then take that from the Mosaic tradition and the Old Testament and bring it forward to the Gospel of John, this post-Easter Jesus, the people are hearing this in what they believe Jesus was probably trying to say. I am is the way. I am is the bread of life. So it brings it into an immediacy that people paid attention to, even though the word is not there in the translations that we get. But scholars suggest maybe that's helpful. So pardon me. That broke it open for me entirely, and it made this start to be even more accessible, and I got even more excited about the Gospel of John. So let me just close with circling then to these words from Sister Ilia Delio when she became a scholar of Teilhard de Chardin. And de Chardin was very much marginalized in his time by the Catholic authorities because Chardin had this mystical vision of the world. And mysticism to him and to many means when we have that direct, unmediated experience of the mystery, the light, the presence, and it can pop up out of nowhere. It often happens without our intending it. I've had an experience like that earlier in my life when I was experiencing this sense of light and love at a very important moment in my life, and it turned my life around. It eventually led me into the ministry. And I'm thinking, so what was that? And I realized many years later, that was what people call a mystical experience, that sense of unitive involvement with the mystery, with the greater source of all that is. So I love it how Ilia Delio brings us back to that core mysticism. And she says this, which we heard earlier, Christ, the Christ spirit, the Christ energy, not necessarily only the person of the historic Jesus, but the energy that was in him. That's available to all of us. And she says, Christ invests, and she puts it in terms of a person, thinking of the male person of Jesus, but you could universalize it too. Christ invests himself organically with all of creation, immersing himself, themselves, in all things in the heart of matter, and thus unifying the world. The universe is physically impregnated. What a beautiful image. And any woman here who's been pregnant boy, being impregnated with something is a pretty big deal. So to the very core of its matter, the world, the cosmos, is impregnated by the influence of that superhuman nature, being the Christ nature. Everything is physically Christified, gathered up by the incarnate Word, and there's great language practically right out of the Gospel of John. Everything is gathered up by the incarnate Word as nourishment that assimilates, transforms, and divinizes. In other words, makes divine, makes sacred. The world is like a crystal lamp, illumined from within by the light of Christ. For those who can see, Christ shines in the diaphanous universe through the cosmos and in nature. So, oh, that we may all dance in that swirl of being. May it be so. Amen.